Another week, another episode of E-SHU News. Last week's file was corrupted, so this week we will cover what was lost from last week and the few results we have from this week. To start off with, I'm your host Fred.
And I'm your co-host Arthur. First, we'll get into League of Legends with NSE. Sheffield Seriousness went 0-1 versus Orn Hub. They went 1-0 versus Star Bardian, 0-1 versus Royal Cubs, and they placed 123rd in the Swiss stage, continuing Swiss stage to fight for a spot in Division 2. Next is the Sheffield Sillies. They were 0-1 versus the Roehampton Rollovers. They went 1-0 versus I Give a Second Chance to Graggy, and they placed 56th in the Swiss stage, continuing Swiss stage again to fight for a spot in Div 2. So we have two teams that are placed in spots for Swiss stage, and those two teams will be both fighting for a spot in Division 2. So I think that's pretty decent. If we move on to University Esports, the Sheffield Seriousness, they went 1-0 against the Big Boys Club, and they sadly went 0-1 versus Pentaful EXE. And now we go to Sheffield Sillies, 0-1 versus Plymouth Leviathans, Team 2.
Then we move on to Overwatch 2. So for NSE, Hallams Hookers went 1-0 versus Cardiff Team 4. They lost 0-2 versus Linkant Break Even. They lost 0-2 versus Booty Banditos and 0-2 versus BC Useless. Hallam Hunters lost 0-2 versus Warwick Angels. They also lost 0-2 versus Throwers, but then they managed to win 2-0 versus Canterbury Cobras and 2-0 versus Kent Give AF. For University Esports, Hallam Hammers lost 0-2 versus Durham Dreamers and lost 1-2 versus Nerf Miner. Hallam Hookers won 2-0 versus Mercy's Feet Picks and lost 0-2 versus Artless Leicester.
Now, swiftly going into Valorant, NSE starting off with not winning 11-13 versus Flex Wukongs. They went 13-11 versus Val second, and they ended up moving to Division 2. They went 8-13 versus Tilting Terrors. And finally, they won, going 14-12 versus Cardiff Red Sheep. Next, we go to the Powerpuff Girls. They went 4-13 versus Leeds Diamond. They went 7-13 versus Idimsum. They won versus Existential Crisis, going 13-10. And they also won versus Portsmouth Kittens, going 1-0. For University Esports, going back to not winning, we have 13-6 versus Warwick Vandals, which is good. Another win under the belt. Sadly, going 10-13 versus Duck Bath.
And unfortunately, I could not get any results for the Powerpuff Girls from University Esports as the website was down. Moving on, we're looking at Rocket League for NSE. Hallam Hammerheads went 1-3 versus Unicorns, 1-3 versus KCL Lions, 3-2 versus Megalodon Sharks, 3-2 versus Portsmouth Paladins, 3-0 versus Portsmouth Pythons, 3-2 versus Newcastle Ninjas, and are in Upper Division 1. Shui lost 0-3 versus UEA Blue Jays, 0-3 versus Trent Thunder Esports, won 1-0 versus Nottingham Nightmares, lost 0-3 versus Staffordshire Sixers A, lost 1-3 versus Limbless Lincoln Tears, and lost 0-3 versus Bath Bombs, and they've been moved down to Division 2. For shooters, they lost 0-3 versus Loughborough Lionesses, won 1-0 versus Beckett Bears, lost 1-3 versus the Better Cardiff, won 3-2 versus Brighton Bears, lost 1-3 versus Nottingham Nightmares, and lost 2-3 versus Warwick Fizzers, and they're in Division 2 with 4 points.
Back to me for Apex Legends. Going to NSE, E-SHU Apex scored a total of 25 points over 4 maps. That gained them 14 league points, which puts them in 18th place with a total of 42 points, which is fantastic from our Apex team. Now going to Rainbow Six Siege, we have NSC with Hallams R6 going 1-0 versus Lincoln Geese, 2-7 versus STG, 7-1 versus the Sussex Sharks, and 7-1 versus BU Border Control. 2-7 versus Joe's Hose, which moved them to their Division 2 games. They went 3-7 versus Neo Citadel, and 7-5 versus STG.
They got their revenge there.
Yeah, I got their revenge.
And that is it for this week. So thank you so much for watching. And as usual, if you've enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing or leave a like. And we hope to see you again next week.
That's E-SHU News, and we're signing off.